Everyone to Friday, what is probably afternoon for most, but if not afternoon, it's probably close. So thank you for joining, and we're going to go through a few slides and some live software, and so I won't have time to show every single feature in 2018 R2, but do want to call out some that seem to be favorites, and so I'll show you a few of those live and the rest of them at least in bullet points, and we'll talk through each and every one. So before we do that, though, I usually like to at least put up the Microsoft Dynamics GP roadmap. And so this gets updated as new releases come to either release point or at least get on the map and the drawing board for a scheduled release. And so, and most of you know, if you've been around technology for a while, that it's really hard to predict more than a couple years into the future what technology might be out there and be available to us. And a lot of that no one controls. Things just happen, things get invented that we don't know about today. And so Microsoft really, like most publishers, they can't look out, 5 or 10 years. That's just that's too many lifetimes in the tech business. So they generally look out a couple. And so right now we're kind of the fourth pillar from the left or third from the right in GP 2018 R2 that shipped about 6 weeks ago, and so that's what we're going to look at today. We're expecting Microsoft to release GP, whatever it might be, 2019 or maybe 2020, sometime in October or November of 2019, so about a year from now, and then GP, whatever the next version might be, 2020, 2021, who knows, sometime in October, November of 2020. And so hard to believe that we're already talking about 2020 right now, but it's not that far away. And so that's kind of the map and the drawing board, so to speak. And most of these versions coming up will be like 2018 R2, will be a lot of features that requested by end users. And so if you have things that you'd like to see in the product, there's a way to get that to Microsoft, and we'll be doing something on that here probably with our year-end classes, making sure that everyone knows how to get their suggestions to Microsoft so that they can get on the list, hopefully, and we can get other users to vote for what you would like to see. Okay, so let's move on to if you are a Dynamics GP user right now, and I suspect most of you are. And so what I like to do is at least kind of put up the current system requirements. So if you're thinking of upgrading to 2018 or 2018 R2, Microsoft supports on your desktop, or laptop, but the machine you work on every day, they support everything from Windows 7 on up through current. And so Windows 8, 8.1, 10, all nicely supported on GP 2018 and 2018 R2. For the kind of extra things that go along with Dynamics GP, way up at the top left there, we have Microsoft Office, current version of Office. And so 2016 is, if you have a local install of Office, is kind of the most recent shipping version. Microsoft does go back 2 versions on most everything, and so Office 2013 is fully supported. If you're on Office 365, that automatically is supported, and so that doesn't really have a year kind of in the version number anymore. That's just Office 365, and it's kind of on perpetual update. And so if you have made the jump to O365, as we call it, then that, of course, will always be supported with GP. Adobe, if you are going to create PDF documents from within GP, Adobe is kind of the official supported system to do that, and Adobe X or Adobe 10 is the version that is supported. Most of you know there are probably a lot of you use one of the free PDF creators out there. There's probably dozens of them, but things like Cute PDF, and there used to be one on the FRX CD that was kind of a no-branded thing that worked very well if you go way back. Most of those work just fine, but again, this is kind of the official supported platform that Microsoft puts out, so we know in real life that many other things work. Same thing if you're going to virtualize your server, which most people have nowadays. Microsoft supports their own virtualization system, which is called Hyper-V. I think most of our clients that run a virtualized server probably use VMware, and that's a head-to-head competitor with Hyper-V. But VMware works very well. And again, I personally haven't seen a virtualized system that is not just running smooth with GP sitting on top of it. But again, if you ask Microsoft, it's they only support their own product. Okay, so on the SQL side, though, this is a big change. If you're not on GP 2018 today, you will have to update your SQL Server software and maybe your hardware, but you're probably running SQL 2008 or maybe 12, but those are no longer supported with GP 2018 or 2018 R2. So you will have to go to a more current version of SQL, which is SQL 14, 16, or 17, and that's generally true for most anybody that's on GP 2013 or 15, probably are still running SQL 2008. So how do we get to 2018 or 2018 R2? Well, if you're on 2013, most of you probably know the rule that you cannot be more than 2 versions back and take a direct jump to the current version. So if you're on 13, you're missing 15 and 16. So 13 has to go to either 15 or 16 and then on to 18. If you're on 15, you can go directly to 2018 R2 as long as you're on at least the 2015 year-end update, which is 3 years ago, and so hopefully you are at least on that version. If you are on the original kind of release to manufacturing or RTM version of 2015, you can still go to 2018 directly, but you would have to service pack your 2015 with a more current service pack first. Same thing with 16. As long as you're current on 16, you can directly go up to 18 or 18 R2. If you're on the initial release of 2016, we would have to service pack that and then get you there. So not a problematic either way, but 2013, you're going to make 2 steps or 2 hops. If you're on something older, GP 10 or 2010, then of course that's a little bit extra work, but very doable, very workable. If you're on an older version or earlier than 2013, do not let that stop you from thinking about upgrading. Okay, so let's get into the features. The first list you see is pulls together those top things that were requested by customers. And so the first one is hiding Business Analyzer in our navigation list. A lot of people never use Business Analyzer, although it's kind of a nice little tool and really had a lot of value, just had a low adoption rate for some reason. Now the system administrative kind of person can hide that so that users don't have to deal with Business Analyzer anywhere in their navigation or even on their home page. Second one is for some people a big deal. For other people was kind of a waste of time, but there was kind of no in between. So either you really wanted this or you don't care, but the GP password now can go all the way up to 21 characters, which is the SQL password length. So in Microsoft SQL Server. So if 15 was just too little, you just didn't feel that was secure, you can now with 2018 R2 go all the way up to 21 characters. So you just have to have a good memory on what that password is. Of course, if you do turn on the password expiration features inside of GP, up to this point, there was no reminder. And if you didn't remember or otherwise know it, your password just expired. Well, they finally decided, you know, it's probably not going to take more than 10 minutes to create a little pop-up box that will notify the user when their password's about to expire. And so about 7 days prior to the expiration date, they will pop a message box when you log in, much like you would see in Windows, that tells you you've got a week and the password's not going to work. We can display our Smart List Designer favorites in navigation list. So Smart List Builder, if you have that third-party product, Smart List Builder can be and has been able to be displayed in the navigation list area of the system for quite some time. If you're using the free out-of-the-box Smart List Designer to create your own Smart List, those can now be displayed in your navigation list. And then we can do some mass updating also in the navigation area, marking customers, vendors, employees, items inactive, or reactivating those that we might have marked inactive, or for vendors, specifically marking vendors as temporary. So I'll show you kind of how that works, or you'll see a little more detail on that. And then a big one is probably the monthly recurring batches, and you'll see how that works here. And so some of these I've just pulled the screenshots out just so we didn't have to spend time navigating, but the password area, when you're on the user setup or user preferences and changing your own password, you'll notice that you can key more into the field. So the field was always long enough, but just the keyable length of the field stopped us at 15. And so now we can go all the way up to 21 if you're really into security. And the message that will pop, just kind of like it does, again, when your network password is about to expire. So you'll have a week to change it, or you can take action and change it right then and there on the spot. I put this screen here. This has nothing to do with the features. This was added, I think, in 2016 or 16 R2. But if you're kind of the system administrator for GP and you have access to the user setup window, there is a summary button there that was added, and they kind of snuck in there back in 2016 days. This actually tells us not how many users we have per se, but the importance of this is the types of users that we have. So most of you probably know that there are 3 different user types now for GP: the full user, which we've always had, the limited user, which is kind of a read-only type user, so you can run any report, you can look at any inquiry window, you can run any smart list designer or builder, anything that queries data out or views data, that limited user can actually perform. And of course, all the security still sits on top of that. So all the permissions and security levels are still kind of in play there. But that limited user cannot do transaction entry, cannot create batches, cannot do any type of data entry, with one very narrow and limited exception, and that's a limited user can actually create a purchase order requisition. So they can initiate a requisition. A lot of times people will say, well, can they do the PO? No, they can't. They can only do the PO requisition. So beyond that, the limited user has no ability to create any new data in the system at all. And then of course the employee self-service user is really for your own employees to log in, and if you're doing payroll or tracking HR in the system, they would be able to enter their time, enter time and expenses into a project, pick up a copy of their pay stub or their W-2 at the end of the year. No need to print those if you have the employee self-service users. And the employee self-service is inquiry only with those things, with a few exceptions, is they can actually initiate changes to their HR profile. So if they move, they have a new address or new marital status or family status change, they have a dependent, need to take a dependent off, and so forth, they can initiate those. Of course, those all have to get handed over to the workflow and run through approval or one approval or more, and before they become permanent. And so that employee self-service can initiate things like that. They can also enter a PO requisition. And so that's the only thing that a limited and employee self-service can do as far as creating data. And then that ESS, employee self-service user, actually can interact with their HR profile. But all that goes through workflow. Even the PO requisition has to go through workflow before that it can be turned into a PO. And so I put this screen in there because a lot of people are starting to acquire these types of users, the limited and some with the employee self-service. And this summary window off the user setup actually shows you how many licenses you have of each category type, because they have a different cost and are somewhat unrelated. And so the licensing is got a few extra dimensions now than what it has since day one. And so here you can see I've got 3 full, 5 limited, and 7 self-service. And then I can see the users that I've actually set up in the system. I have 2, the SQL System Administrator and the Dynamics SA, Dynamics System Administrator. And those are flagged as full users when I set those up. And so that's a handy little screen. Doesn't have anything to do with the version that we're talking about today, but since we were there, I thought I would call that out. So here's the monthly recurring batch feature. So this works for receivables, payables, inventory, and within any of those that have monthly or bi-monthly batch frequencies, you have the option to check a box, which you see highlighted there, that tells the system that you want the batch date to be the last day of the month. And so here I've got a posting date of April 30th. Well, when I post this and it updates for May, it would typically have May 30th as the posting date. Well, that bothers some people, I guess. And so if you check this box, it would actually default to the last day of the month. And so, you know, for February, it would be the 28th. Obviously, it couldn't do the 29th most of the time, or the 30th or 31st. And so you would typically set this to be like the 28th, and that way all months at least have 28 days. But if that's troubling you that the monthly batch posts on the 28th, you really want it to post on the end of the month, whatever that might be, this little feature will get that done. Here's the Business Analyzer option to toggle the BA module off. You can do that on your home page, as I said earlier, or you can take the Business Analyzer out of your navigation list pages. And I will try to remember when we get over to GP to show where those things show up. I do not have mine turned off. I actually have mine on and running. And so I'll point out where those things are if you haven't seen the Business Analyzer in the past. So then we go into the sales features that have been added in 2018 R2. We can print an invoice and the functional currency of the invoice or the customer directly from the sales order processing navigation list. So if you're using the navigation list to do some printing, you can print now in the functional currency. So before that was not available. You had to go out to the individual document or the batch to be able to get that done. The sales workflow, which has been very popular, was missing a pretty, what I would call, key component, and that was the credit limit. And so that's a pretty important field in the sales world. And so that's been added where we can actually then trigger workflow and do things based on a customer's credit limit amount. Microsoft created a new smart list for deposits on unposted sales transactions. And so I'll show you kind of what that looks like here on another slide. But the idea here is that we've taken a customer deposit and we haven't posted the invoice yet. And so that probably, if at least in theory, if all goes well, the customer deposits liability account that's on our balance sheet, we would have a smart list that supported that balance. And so we had money that we took from people. We haven't posted the invoice, so that money is still a liability back to the customer. Well, there's a smart list now that supports that balance if you've done everything correctly. When we are emailing or possibly printing any sales order document, now we have the ability or the option to print and generate the email all in one step at the same time. We don't have to do one or the other. And so that was kind of a nuisance for folks that still did a little printing, but also emailed a copy out. So hopefully you don't really do that for the same customer. That you have to educate your customer that it's one or the other. They shouldn't want both, but some people do that. The ones in blue here, I'm actually going to show you. And so they've added some additional sort options in the sales order processing item inquiry window. And so you'll see kind of what those look like. And then not a 2018 R2 feature, but a 2018 feature was the ability to email a customer statement right from the customer card, the maintenance window. So you don't have to go through the whole routines process and probably do a whole bunch of mouse clicking just to get an individual customer statement anymore. Although you can do that, it still works. It's just if you're talking to a customer and you happen to have their card open, sometimes you just want to pop up a statement real quick, or maybe you got somebody standing at the counter or the window and you just want to grab a statement. Well, this is much faster because you're down to maybe 2 clicks here to get that done. And then the last thing in the sales series is the customer combiner tool that is part of the professional services tools library that's free. And so some of you might use the customer combiner or changer, but on the combiner part of that tool, combiner meaning that we're taking multiple customers and combining them into one. And so the customers that went away, well, their ship-to addresses, of course, went away as well. And so now the combiner will actually retain the ship-to addresses if they're different from the ship-to on the surviving customer. So if the surviving customer has the exact same ship-to address, and it's not the text of the address, but it's the key field, so it's the name of the address. If the primary customer has an address called Houston, for example, and one of the customers that you're combining into the surviving has one called Houston, well, then it's not going to save both of those. But if the customer being combined has Dallas and Austin, and the surviving customer only has Houston, then the Dallas and Austin addresses will be kept and rolled into the surviving customer. So that's kind of nice. You don't have to go set those things back up. And so let's, at this point, let's end the slides. We'll go take a look here at the actual software. And so we'll show a couple of these things. So the first one over in our sales area here is the sales item inquiry. And so this is the window. It's not a new window, but what they have added are these sort by fields. And so these were added back to customers and vendors in 2016, I think R2. And so they had not gotten around to this window, and they still had this on their list, so to speak. And so they've gone ahead and added that in. So how that works is, let's say I just pick an item number here, and of course if I redisplay I get not too much data, so that's not too bad. But then I actually want to look at this kind of a secondary sort, and I want to do that by customer, and we'll open this up so we can see the customer. And then I can sort this ascending, which is my default, or I can flip it the other way, and so now I can see customers in kind of reverse order. So mine are alphanumeric since I'm in the sample company or the demo company here. And so that's a nice feature. If you use this window, you will appreciate the time that this saves you to have these additional sort and look up features here. And so that's really what that one is about. Of course, the statement driven off the customer card is exactly that. So I'll just pop up a customer here. And when I go to print, statement is might be your only option. I do have some SQL reports available for this screen as well, but I added those, so yours might just say statement. And so we'll see here, if you are familiar with the routines, you have the blank, long, and short. And so we'll go ahead and just print that. And with just a couple of clicks there, I get, this has not been modified at all or changed for logos and so forth, but we'll get the statement that you would normally get directly from the routines window. So they didn't invent anything new here. They just added the functionality to actually print this from the customer card. So that makes that a whole lot more efficient if you print customer statements. Okay, so we'll travel back to the slide here. And let's make sure we didn't forget anything. So the customer credit limit, again, was added to the workflow. And so I just have a copy of the workflow screen where that field is exposed now to workflow, so we can take action against things that involve the customer's credit limit amount. And then, of course, when they added that, they added a new email message to work with the workflow that references the customer credit limit. And so that's all been put in there. So surprised that took as long as it did. So that seems to be a pretty key field when you're working with customers. So here's the smart list that they've created that shows the customer deposits where we don't have an invoice that's been posted. So these are kind of true liabilities back to our customers, since we haven't sold or finalized, maybe we haven't shipped or whatever it might be, but we just don't have the invoice posted. So here you'll see I've got 2, and they're in order status, yet we've taken money on deposit for these transactions. So some of you might have created this. If you do a lot of that, you might have your own smart list, either designer or builder type reports already. So if you do, those are fine, but you can now use the out-of-the-box list if you want to. So here's a sales transaction print window. So just designating here that we can print and also generate an email document all in one step, so we don't have to circle back and do one after the other. Okay, so we flip over to kind of the purchasing, kind of payables and PO type functionality in Dynamics GP 2018. First one there is if you do use the purchase requisitions, you might have figured out that when a requisition is approved, you have to buy exactly what was on the requisition as approved. So if you don't, then that sends the workflow back into action and kind of potentially delays the process. In 2018 R2, you have the option of buying less than what was approved as far as quantity. So just flip over here so you can kind of see how this looks. So here I had a requisition for 100, and you'll see kind of in the middle of the screen the 100 quantity there right above the message that's popped up. But if you look upwards to the left there, the quantity to purchase, I've actually changed down to 90. And so that's what that feature does, is allow me to buy less than what was approved there. Now, I can't go over the 100, of course. That would send the workflow back into action and require additional approvals. But with this feature, I can request less than what was approved. The next one, which we'll take a look at in the live software, they've added the vendor document number to the payables all-in-one view. And if you're not using the payables all-in-one view, or the receivables all-in-one view, or the inventory all-in-one view, you might want to take a look at that. It's a really nice way to look at the data that's already in the system. If we put a vendor on hold, they've put the proverbial little stop sign that's been around for many years into the vendor system, just like they have into the customer system that's been there for a long, long time. So I'll kind of show you what that looks like, although don't get overly excited. It's a simple thing, but kind of a nice little feature. Finally got around to adding the Inactive Checkbooks feature. So when you're looking up a checkbook, anywhere that you would drill down and see all the different bank accounts or checkbooks that you have in the system, if you have inactive checkbooks, you can exclude those now from your lookups, much like you can inactive employees, items, customers, accounts, vendors, and so on. If you deal with purchase orders and you happen to email those, well, you might realize today that you can only email the PO blank form, and so there's only one other choice unless you have project accounting, and that's the PO other form. Well, we can now email the purchase order other form in addition to the blank. So I'll show you the edit they made to that screen if that's something you do. And I think kind of a big one to me personally is they have defaulted in the checkbook ID when you're creating a check batch, or when you're paying payables that pay with checks, so not EFTs, but checks. Well, you probably know, if you've used the software more than a couple of months, that you have to add the checkbook in every time you're going to create a check batch. And many people wondered why that is. If they've defaulted the checkbook in their payable setup and said, that's the checkbook I use most of the time, why do I have to select that when I create a check batch? And there wasn't a good answer for that. So they finally allow us to default that in. All right, so we will exit the slides here and go back to the live software. So the first thing we'll look at in purchasing is the all-in-one view. And again, if you don't use this and you're on a version that has it, which should be 2013 or later, this is a really nice feature. And so I'll just bring up Advanced Office here. And so you'll see when I do that, it loads all of the columns that I've asked to be presented. And of course, you can decide which columns should be presented in this view. And if you don't have finance charges or miscellaneous charges, well, then you would take those off and not clutter up the screen. But the change they made to this window was, instead of just the kind of the internal voucher number or the system generated number, which are the blue kind of drill back numbers there, they've actually added the document number here. And so you see that's our number. So these are my check numbers. These are the vendor's invoice numbers, because that's typically how we refer to things. We don't go around talking about, voucher, 1,000,000,461. That's not that common. And so if you haven't seen this window, that's kind of not the point of the feature they added. But if this is new to you, you should check it out. So just very quickly, if I want to see what invoices ended up on this particular check or payment, all I have to do is tick that box, and everything to the left clears off that's not on that check, my check 20036. So this was the invoice, that was the receipt, and that was the purchase order. And so you can now easily today say, this PO 2066, where did that get paid? And so that's very, very easy to do, which in the past, that was kind of a struggle. And so if you want to see this credit, what invoice did that credit get applied to? Well, it's right there. And that might have been almost that easy in the traditional inquiry window, but this is a very powerful way to look at the data that is brand new to the system. So if you haven't checked out these all-in-one views, make a promise you're going to do that before the end of this year and get used to those. Oh, the other thing I was going to show you was the little stop sign. And so I think this capital is on hold, yes. And so when I select capital printed circuits, I see the little stop sign that has been housed in the sales module for so long is now a brand new feature to the purchasing module. And so any place we see an inquiry on that vendor. So if I go to transactions by vendor, this is the other window that I was referring to that competes now with the all-in-one. This is the only window we've had really for inquiry, and we kind of just lived through it. But I would submit for your testing that the all-in-one view window will be much, much easier and more intuitive than the way that this window is organized. So you can see this vendor is on hold and that little stop sign pops right up there. So that was the feature there. So when we get over to purchase orders, if we're going to email these out, so I'll just grab one here, click on the email button, up to 2018 R2, you weren't prompted to pick the form because it only did the blank form. Now you have the huge option here of picking the other form. So I wish they would add about 20 more forms to this list, but it is what it is. At least we can email both of these forms now. So that's that particular feature. And then the last thing I think in purchasing is when we create a check batch. So we'll just do anywhere that we can get to this batch ID. So you'll see when I create a new batch, this checkbook ID now pops in there from my AP setup. And so that's a little thing, but if you have to select that once a week for 10 or 20 years, that's a little bit of a nuisance. So those are kind of what we have seen in purchasing. So let's go now on to the financial section. And let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Nope. So in the financial area, which is kind of everything else, so payroll, GL, some kind of generic things. The first one is on the historical inventory trial balance. If you use that report, you know now that you get a big report and probably have a lot of zeros for items that don't have any quantities. And you have to just kind of ignore those. Well, they built a feature now. Let me just show it to you while we're talking about it. So here's the screen, the HITB screen. So exact same screen with this exception in red there. We can now exclude items that either have no value or have no quantity. And so by default, when you create a new report option, by default, they will be unchecked. The thinking is that, yeah, you probably don't really need to see stuff that isn't there. So if you want those for whatever reason, you just can't live without them, you can go add those back just to make them show up on the report, even though they won't have a quantity or a value. You can actually populate those back. But that's kind of a nice feature if you run that report. If you don't, be glad you don't. But if you do, that will probably save a huge amount of paper and time. Second item here is we can now post from the subledgers all the way through the general ledger if we're posting at the transaction level in the subledger. So you probably know today that if you batch post in the subledger, so payables, receivables, sales order processing, you name it, if you post from a subledger and you put those transactions in a batch, you can optionally post all the way through to the general ledger without creating a GL batch. And so that's what a lot of people do. But if you decide in the subledger that you're not going to batch your transactions, you just want to put a payables voucher in and click the post button, even though you have the flag set to post that all the way through to the GL, Dynamics GP won't do that. If you real-time post in the subledger, it forces a batch to be created in the general ledger until now. So now we have the option of still honoring the post all the way through the general ledger if we're real-time posting the subledger. So I think personally, for the last 22 years, I think that's that one thing is a huge change to the way the system works for the better. And so I'll show you that setup flag. We talked about the monthly and bi-monthly recurring batches that we can use the last date of the month to actually post those. So that's we've already covered. We can disable duplicate check numbers. You might say, well, we can do that today. Well, you can today in accounts payable and payroll, but if you're using the miscellaneous check form or the bank reconciliation transaction where you put a check number in, the duplicate check number flag was not honored in those two areas. And so that was, some people might have called that a bug. That was just a missing feature. And so now with 2018 R2, the system enforces that. And that's not an option, it just does it. And so let's flip over and take a look here. So here's my checkbook setup or checkbook maintenance. There's nothing to do once we check the override check number way down at the bottom on the right side there that's got the checkbox marked. Once we do that, that enforces that in the bank transaction entry and in the miscellaneous check. And so again, that always worked in payables and payroll, but did not work in the other two parts of the system. And so that was a little bit of a, caused some people a little bit of a snag there. If you run payroll out of Dynamics GP, it might have bothered you for a long time that you had to manually total up the FICA numbers, the employer, the employee, and the matching amounts. And so that would have been a valid concern. Well, now the system actually would total those up for you. If you run payroll, and you might be dealing with this next one, which is kind of a law requirement here. We have to look at the shared maximum for benefits and deductions. It's specifically required around our 401k setup. And so I'll show you what that screen looks like. And they've also added the ability to put a start and an end date on a pay code. And so that's kind of nice if you do payroll and you want to assign some pay codes to people, but maybe they're not effective until January 2019. Well, you might have a lot of time on your hands as we kind of go into the holiday season here at the end of the year. Sometimes things slow down. It'd really be nice if you could get those pay codes set up and all functional, just not ready to be used. And yes, if you're doing the payroll transaction entry, you just have to remember, don't use those new pay codes. But if someone else is doing it, maybe they inadvertently used one or something, and that's going to not be good. So we have the ability to start and stop when a pay code is valid. And I'll show you what that looks like. And if you're one of the few clients using the web client for Dynamics GP, the letter writing assistant wizard is available now in the web client. So what do some of these things look like? So here's the inactive checkbooks. Not anything real thrilling there. It's just they added this same feature that we've had for several years for customers, items, accounts, vendors, employees, and so on. We can now exclude off checkbooks that we're no longer using. So here's the mass update feature from the navigation list. So we can take action now on things like accounts, employees, checkbooks, customers, vendors, items, and mark a collection of the records. And then up at the top, you see kind of highlighted in red the new options. I can inactivate in mass now. So if we have a whole bunch of customers or a whole bunch of vendors that we're going to inactivate, this is a real quick and easy way to do it, or maybe quicker and easier than what we were doing when we had to do it one by one. And so that's really what that's about. And of course, if we want to come back and reactivate, we can do that in mass as well. So here's the Smart List favorites in the navigation list. And so this allows me to see my own Smart List that I have built. So Smart List Builder has always been available. Smart List Designer was not until now. And so those things that I have created as favorites are available now in the navigation list, which means I don't even have to open Smart List if I don't want to. So all of my favorites are here. Here's the benefits and the deductions, kind of the shared limit setup. And so what happens here is when we're running payroll, the year-to-date amount for any one of these benefits and deductions is compared to this calendar year maximum of, in my case, 27,500, and the processing then handled accordingly. And so the calendar year max will be the ultimate stopping point, and so the year-to-date amount won't be allowed to go over the calendar year maximum. So what was happening is, I think, was people that had a lot of court-ordered garnishments, let's say child support or things like that, IRS, maybe bankruptcies and whatnot. Well, they would, try to max out some of their other deductions like 401k, when normally they maybe weren't even putting into the 401k plan. Suddenly they're going to max that out so that they reduce maybe what they had to fork over in some of those garnishments. And so this will help kind of monitor that. So this is actually a new window, brand new screen for us to use to do that. So here's the payroll check register, and you'll see kind of outlined in red. This is a little bit blurry, but you kind of get the idea here that now we have the FICA totals. So we've got the employer FICA, the Medicare, and then that totaled up. And so you might have done that in Report Writer, or maybe had us do that. So certainly pretty easy to do in Report Writer. But you kind of ask why? Why should we have to do that? Why should we have to modify a report to put something in there that really belongs in there? And so they made this part of the out-of-the-box report for us. Okay, so let's go back to the software here for the last time, and I'll show you that posting setup feature, which I think is kind of a big thing. So if we go into posting, and doesn't matter where we go, so this is true in any part of the system. So if I go into sales transaction entry, just for example, you'll see this new line right here, post through general ledger files. So that wasn't there, or that's not there in your version. And so that, again, allows me to post the subledger without batches and not have batches created in my general ledger. So I literally can post kind of real time with one click in the subledger, and my GL is updated accordingly. And so that is, I think, from desiring that for a long time. That's nice to finally see in the system. So let's flip over to pay codes. And so I'll do it the old-fashioned way here. So we'll just grab a pay code here for one of my people, and you'll see the start date and end date fields now sitting on top of the rest of what was there in the pay code maintenance window here. And so pay codes, kind of how that works is if you are building a batch that has this pay code in it, the check build will ignore this if it's prior to the start date or after the end date. It will exclude that pay code. And so it really is kind of date sensitive there. Let's see, you saw the smart list favorites, just kind of showing that since when here. So here's my smart list favorites here. When I click on that, I see all of my smart lists that I have flagged that are available to me for purchasing. And so I'm in the purchasing series here. So of course I'm only going to see purchasing, but this allows me to really not even have to open the smart list, as I can run any smart list here for purchasing that I might want to. And of course that would be true with sales or inventory or payroll or HR, or project accounting or whatever it might be. So that's kind of a nice, it's a little time saver. We're not adding functionality per se, just efficiency, if you will. So all right, so let's go quickly finish up here. And the last piece, which involves something new, and that's called the Intelligent Edge. You might have heard a little bit about this, and if you haven't, you will. Microsoft is optionally, and I'll stress optionally, connecting your on-premises Dynamics GP with their Business Central cloud. And so as an option, and only if you want to, and there is a small cost to this, you would have to have a user into this Business Central cloud. And so a user's $70 a month, and that's a named user, so you'd have to have at least one. So at least $70 a month. Not everybody is going to want to do that, even though that's not a hugely expensive cost. It's you might say, well, why do I need it? Well, you don't, but should you desire to expose your Dynamics GP data into the Microsoft cloud, they then in turn will allow you to use some of their artificial intelligence, their business intelligence, to be able to look at your data and report it back to you. And so, well, what's that look like? So we'll go back to Dynamics GP. Let me go back to my home page. And you'll see my traditional home page. And I said if I remembered, I would show you the Business Analyzer. And so you see that here kind of running in my home page. And I have a number of things kind of lit up here. Of course, some of my data is in different period than what today's date is. So if I update the report here, the graph, to actually the date of my Dynamics data, then that instantly lights up there. So this is a little application that they built a number of years ago, and it had a little lackluster response, although I personally like it. Not everybody did. And so that's what they're talking about when they say you can turn off the Business Analyzer, so people don't put that on their home page. And so that would be the connection over here. So this would basically turn off where they couldn't go grab any of those graphs or charts or reports. The other thing that it does, well, as an option, is to turn that off onto your home page or your navigation list. And so if I go into, let's just say vendors, for example. So let's say I wanted to take advantage of that new feature by inactivating a bunch of vendors as I get close to the end of the year and starting to clean up my system here. And you'll see the little flag here for this vendor that was on hold, if you remember. So it's a circle. Now, I don't know why they didn't like the stop sign over here, but the stop sign works on the other screens, but I noticed that when I come over here, it's a circle. So I don't know what that's about, but at least we have the feature there. So if I wanted to come in and let's say I was going to turn these 3 vendors inactive, so that's the feature that I showed you on the slide. But you'll see off to the right of my list view here that I have the Business Analyzer actually running inside of my navigation list, my navigation view. And so the other option is to turn that off. And so if you're not using it, sometimes these will just load with nothing, and people wonder what they are. They're just empty little screens here. So you don't have to have it running on your navigation or your home page. But anyway, if you've never seen this business analyzer and the charts and graphs that are in there, that it's something you own, so everybody has it. It was all free. Of course, some of these would have to be hooked to your data because they're hooked to the sample data, and so they have to be rehooked, which usually is not a difficult thing at all. But if that's something that you want to explore, even though Microsoft is telling you now you can turn it off, if that's something that has interest at all, let us know, and we can talk to you about how that might work. Okay, so back to the home page, and last topic is this Intelligent Edge. So my traditional home page here, which will look like a lot of yours, I got a lot of things plugged into it, but typical GP home page. But you'll notice in R2, and I have this turned on, I can get now to my Intelligent Cloud Insights. And so that's where my data gets exposed into the cloud. I got to pay the $70 a month to actually be able to use the Power Apps, the business intelligence, the artificial intelligence that Microsoft has built. And I start to see things like this. And so where I'm echoed back in kind of a KPI form, in this case, my cash, what my sales profitability looks like, profit, net income, inventory value, what I've got sitting in inventory. And I can see over here some other deep insights into my data. 10 of my customers are late with payments, so I'm lucky. That's not very many, but you know, if it's my top 10 customers, and that might be a problem. 13 invoices weren't paid by you on time. Well, that's because 10 people owe me money. So how can I pay if I don't get paid? And so you start to see kind of some of what's available out there in the Microsoft cloud. They've spent a lot of money and a lot of time generating a lot of this business intelligence, and it's my own data, so I'm not obviously seeing someone else's data. That would be a little bit of a problem. So it's my stuff, my Dynamics GP data. But the reason they built this is they don't want GP people that are running GP on-prem to feel excluded from the work that they've done in their intelligent cloud. And so this is an option, not a free one, but a fairly cost-effective one, that if you would like to use some of that power that they have in their Business Central cloud, that they do have a way for you to do that. And so this is brand new. This is 6 weeks old. We're still kind of learning what we can and can't do with it and how it works, but it is functional and seems to be working well. And again, it's just using their templates to look at my data. Now you might say, well, I could do that with Power BI or Jet Express or whatever, Jet Reports. Yeah, all true, you can. And if you're doing that, then you really have no need of using their intelligent cloud and paying for that. So it's just an option, and I like to at least make you aware of it. And so if you have questions about that, or you want to talk more about that, just let us know, and we can get you some more information or kind of talk specifically about how that works. So Caitlin, I think for Friday, for most of us afternoon, I think that's all we've got today. Are there any questions that are out there in the queue?
Yes, we did have a couple questions come in. The first question is, did Microsoft add any additional out-of-the-box SSRS reports for GP?
So good question. No, they have not added any additional reports for GP. What they have done instead is they've created 4 kind of Power BI content packs. And I thought I had that turned on here. I do have mine working, so let me do that. That might take a few seconds to populate there, but I've got a panel down here for Power BI. But they've kind of stopped developing new SSRS reports, but they are putting lots of attention into, I'm just going to open it on my desktop because that's a little faster, and so you'll be able to see it instead of waiting for GP to populate. That does take a little bit of time to actually get into GP because it has to come from the Microsoft Cloud. And so this is a Power BI report that I did, and so just to see if I could figure this out one afternoon when I was at a trade show, and so not very attractive, but not anything overly complex, but pretty simple for the most part, but very easy to do. If you want to see what they've done, we can go into the content pack, and that will load up here in a second. So the answer is no, but good news is they do have the content packs which run in Power BI. And so Power BI is free until you want to share, and then you got to pay. And so if I build these, so like this one behind, and by the way, this is all the free version. I built this. I can view it and use it for free forever. Well, so they're telling us. I wouldn't necessarily guarantee the forever, but for the foreseeable future, it's all free. If I want to share that with someone else, so if I want another user to actually run that report and look at it, whether they're in Power BI or inside of Dynamics GP, then that cost, and the cost of Power BI is $9.99 a month per user. So again, not super expensive, but not completely free. So here are the dashboards that Microsoft built, and this is kind of in place of what they would have normally continued to add to SSRS. And so here, again, it's looking at my data. I can see a dashboard for financial, one for sales, and of course, these are active, and so anywhere on the dashboard I click, have dynamically configured the data here. And you can use these. These are free. They just have to be downloaded and hooked up to your database. And you might want to tweak some of these. So, if you don't, you don't want the top 10 customers, you want the top 5 or the top 50 or items or whatever it might be. Obviously, those are real easy tweaks to make, but you might want to take part of this out if you say, oh, I don't really deal with that. I don't care about that. Obviously, we can help you do that, but we have dedicated people that all they work on is Power BI stuff now because it's that popular. So anyway, long answer to a fairly easy question. What else, Caitlin?
Perfect. Another question is Smart List Designer easier to use than Smart List Builder?
Oh, that's that's not an easy question to answer. It depends. Smart List Builder's been out for quite a while. Most of our team is pretty comfortable with it. A lot of end users, they don't work in it every day, and so it's still a little bit intimidating. I personally, and this is just opinion, so take it for what it's worth, I personally think Designer is simpler than Builder because Microsoft looked at Builder for a long time, and in fact, they were kind of selling it for E1 for a long time, and then they gave it back to them and built their own. And I think they took everything that kind of people didn't like so much about Builder and they put into Designer. So I think, yes, it maybe is simpler, but that's just me.
Great. So looks like there are no additional questions, which we're at the 3 o'clock Central Time mark, so that works great. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's presentation, and thank you, Brian, for giving us this great overview on Dynamics GP 2018 R2. And if any later questions do come up, please feel free to reach out to either Brian or myself. You will be seeing a follow-up email later today with a link to the recording on YouTube. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
All right. Thanks, Caitlin, and bye, everybody.